The palace corridors stood frozen. Just moments ago, aides were bustling with final touches for the highly anticipated royal event, but then, William uttered 10 words that stunned them all. Camilla, Queen Consort, was banned. No explanation, no warning. A single command that tore through royal tradition and shattered public illusion. But what did William find that pushed him to the brink? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Chaos erupted behind closed doors. Advisors scrambled to understand the prince's motivation, while staff were caught between following royal protocol and executing a command that defied every convention. The event, a commemorative ceremony that had been in planning for months, was moments away from going live to an international audience. Now, the narrative had shifted from remembrance to crisis. Senior aides, visibly shaken, attempted to reach William for clarity. But he remained sealed off in his private chamber, unwilling to take calls or respond to official inquiries. The absence of justification fueled speculation like wildfire across royal and media circles alike. In the Queen Consort's wing, the mood was far more combustible. Witnesses described Camilla's reaction as a volatile mix of outrage and a strange, eerie calm. She reportedly uttered a single phrase before slamming her door shut. "He finally knows." It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. But what did she mean by that? What was it William had come across that instantly made her presence at this highly visible event unacceptable? Some insiders believed Camilla had been anticipating this moment all along. Others whispered that she'd always feared one day the past would catch up to her. Still, no one expected such a public fallout to begin without a single leak, rumor, or even a hint of warning. This wasn't just an argument behind royal walls, it was a statement. For William, who has always been seen as the calm within the storm, this move marked a dramatic departure from his usual diplomacy. Not only was the Queen Consort now uninvited, she was being barred from an event that would be attended by global dignitaries, charity leaders, and international press. The message was unmistakable, a line had been crossed. But no one, not even Charles, seemed to know what that line was. There was no official statement, no damage control press release, only silence from Kensington Palace and a cancelled name tag where Camilla's seat had been arranged. Yet buried beneath the immediate tension was something far more profound. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage. It was a decision born from knowledge that until now had been hidden, protected, and possibly even erased from official records. For William to take such a bold and public step, something seismic must have shifted in the foundation of trust within the family. Camilla's reaction hinted at long-held secrets and buried betrayals. The event was no longer just about legacy, it had become the site of a royal reckoning. All eyes were on the Prince of Wales, but behind him stood shadows of the past, and somewhere in that darkness was the answer. But to understand why William made such a decisive move, we must unravel what he discovered, because once it surfaced, there was no going back. Behind locked doors inside Clarence House, William stumbled upon a folder that had never been catalogued, never been referenced in any official archive. Sealed under his late grandmother's personal security detail, this folder held photographs, letters, and one voice recording that changed everything. It began innocently enough. William, in the midst of preparing a tribute for the upcoming royal ceremony, had requested a review of Queen Elizabeth II's private correspondence and estate materials. Among the many meticulously categorized documents lay one slim, unassuming folder, tucked beneath a thick leather-bound binder, marked for ceremonial orders. At first glance, it seemed misplaced, marked only by a faded label that read Personal Reflections 1996. But when he opened it, William's world shifted. Inside were personal letters from the late Queen herself, notes written in her unmistakable hand, laced with expressions of concern, hesitation, and most shockingly, regret. She wrote about Camilla, not as the warm figure the public had come to accept, but as a force of disruption. One line, scrawled in faded ink, struck William like a thunderbolt. Her influence over Charles is deep, perhaps irreversible. The folder also contained a photograph, a candid image showing Charles and Camilla during a time that didn't quite match the public timeline of their rekindled relationship. But that was only the beginning. Beneath the photo, carefully wrapped in parchment, was a small cassette tape. A label affixed in Diana's handwriting read for William. If found, listen carefully. With trembling hands, William retrieved an old player and pressed play. The voice that followed was unmistakably his mother's, soft but firm, emotional yet composed. She spoke of the relentless manipulation, of how isolated she felt within the palace walls, and most chillingly of Camilla's calculated rise through the ranks of royal power. She warned of how truth had been rewritten, and how loyalty had become a currency traded by those closest to the throne. Then came the phrase that shattered the silence of that secluded office: "She'll stop at nothing, even if it means destroying the crown." Diana's voice broke slightly, but her message remained clear: this wasn't paranoia. This was prophecy. William listened to the recording 3 times. Each time, the weight of its truth deepened. His breathing grew heavier. The once distant doubts he had buried years ago began to claw their way to the surface. He wasn't just hearing a voice from the past, he was standing face to face with a version of history no one dared to acknowledge. A history that cast Camilla not as a consort of calm, but as an architect of chaos. And now, in his hands, was evidence that could no longer be dismissed as speculation or conspiracy. William didn't call an aide. He didn't consult advisors. He didn't wait for protocol to guide him. He stood in silence for nearly an hour, the folder still open before him, his mother's voice still echoing in his ears. Then, without another word, he picked up his phone and made the call that would change everything. Camilla was to be removed from the guest list. No press, no reason, no royal justification. Just a ban. Silent, swift, and unchallengeable. The ceremonial team was told to revise the program immediately. The Queen Consort's name was to be stricken from the seating chart. And as aides scrambled to make sense of the order, William walked out of the room not as a son grieving the past, but as a future king prepared to confront it. But what if this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about a deliberate cover-up, one orchestrated from inside the royal circle? In the forgotten depths of royal archives lay the voice of a woman the world never truly heard. Diana's final recorded message wasn't one of peace, it was a coded warning. A confession. And in it, she named Camilla directly, accusing her of orchestrating chaos from behind palace walls. The recording, once muffled by years of silence, now screamed with devastating clarity. Diana's voice, shaky but unmistakably strong, carried the weight of a woman cornered, gaslit, and left in the cold corridors of a monarchy that had long abandoned her. Her words did not seek vengeance, they sought clarity. And yet, within that clarity was a horror too great to ignore. She spoke of being watched. Not just by paparazzi, but by people inside. Names she never revealed, but affiliations she hinted at. Those who claimed to serve the crown, but whose true loyalty was to Camilla. A subtle army of shadows who isolated her, warped narratives, and slowly erased her presence while she was still alive. Diana described the cold indifference of palace walls that once promised her dignity. She recalled conversations with Charles that left her in tears, convinced he no longer saw her as a wife or even the mother of his sons. "He's gone," she whispered in the tape. "Too far gone. She got to him long before I knew what was happening." But it wasn't simply heartbreak. Diana recounted orchestrated episodes that now, in retrospect, read like psychological warfare. Last-minute cancellations, misleading advisors, false reassurances. It wasn't clumsiness, it was choreography. "They want me to unravel," she said. "They want me to look mad so they can walk away without guilt, and she's behind it all." As William sat there, the full emotional weight of his mother's voice bore down on him. She sounded exhausted, yet certain. A woman nearing the end of her rope, but one who refused to be silenced without leaving something behind. Her words built toward one final blow, a chilling sentence that would echo across generations. "If anything happens to me, start with her." The room reportedly went dead quiet as the final seconds of the tape ticked out. William didn't speak. He didn't move. It was as if his entire body had been drained of warmth, of air, of belief. Those closest to him said his hands shook uncontrollably, and that he didn't speak for hours afterward. But inside, something was rising. Rage, grief, clarity, because for years William had accepted the official story. the narrative painted neatly by palace aides and historical revisionists. Now, for the first time, he was hearing the raw truth from the one person who had lived it. This wasn't a story about jealousy or failed marriages. This was about power, about manipulation, and about the crown's willingness to protect its own at any cost, even if it meant burying the truth alongside the woman who had tried so desperately to reveal it. The recording was never meant to be public. It wasn't designed for legacy, it was meant for protection. For her sons. And in that moment, William knew that to ignore it would be to betray everything Diana had tried to shield him from. With a single phrase, his world had changed. What he thought he knew about loyalty, duty, and truth had been shattered. And in its place stood a reckoning, cold and unforgiving. With Diana's voice echoing in his mind, William began connecting dots, and what emerged was a web of manipulation reaching into the present. They weren't palace aides. They weren't royal advisors. They were loyalists, men and women who owed their status, titles, and power to one woman, Camilla. And their purpose? To protect her position at all costs, even if that meant rewriting history. What William uncovered wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was the revelation of a deeply embedded power structure that operated beneath the surface of royal formality. For over 2 decades, Camilla had quietly built her own empire within the monarchy. It was a web of personal allegiances, unspoken favors, and strategic placements that ensured her influence reached further than anyone had dared to imagine. The names on the roster were familiar private secretaries, long-standing communications directors, policy advisors, but their true roles had been cloaked in loyalty contracts, most unspoken yet ironclad. Whispers within the palace labeled them the Inner 12, though no official list existed. They were the ones who rerouted sensitive documents, intercepted inquiries, and dictated narratives before they ever reached the public. According to a former staffer, an anonymous whistleblower now in hiding, key documents involving Princess Diana's legacy had been intercepted and diverted. Reports intended for official archives never made it. Personal letters that should have been returned to William or Harry had been redirected under the guise of misfiling or administrative error. The same source claimed there were moments, particularly following Diana's passing, when her charitable foundations were nearly dismantled, not out of mismanagement, but to sever the emotional link between Diana and the public eye. Every trace of her lasting power had been methodically minimized, erased, or diluted, so Camilla's rise wouldn't be shadowed by the woman she replaced. It went further. Strategic press briefings had been conducted behind closed doors. Royal correspondents were fed narratives that subtly undermined Diana's memory, while painting Camilla in a more palatable light. Negative stories were redirected toward Harry and Meghan in later years, a convenient distraction from the true source of internal palace manipulation. And while Charles was certainly the face of the monarchy, it became increasingly clear that he may not have been fully aware of the internal mechanics orchestrated in his name. There were moments, insiders suggest, when Charles appeared confused by headlines or decisions that were supposedly approved by him. In reality, decisions were being influenced, if not entirely controlled, by those whose primary allegiance was not to the crown, but to Camilla herself. This wasn't a simple case of behind-the-scenes maneuvering. It was a network within a network. A silent command structure that operated parallel to the official royal hierarchy. While the public saw pageantry and tradition, behind the curtains, this secret council ensured Camilla's reign was not just accepted, but embedded. What alarmed William most was the longevity and depth of this network. It had survived transitions, royal scandals, even the Queen's passing. And now, it stood exposed not to the public yet, but to him. It made the ban not just justified, but necessary. This wasn't about optics anymore. It was about truth. But while William traced the roots of manipulation, the public was preparing to see something very different: the royal event Camilla had just been banned from. On a day meant to honor the legacy of the late Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana, every camera turned toward one thing: the empty seat, reserved for Queen Camilla, left untouched. And in its silence, a louder message than any royal speech ever given. The moment the ceremony began, the energy shifted. What was designed to be a reverent celebration of royal womanhood quickly transformed into a symbolic battlefield. Beneath the grandeur of floral arrangements and orchestrated pageantry stood a single vacant chair, its name tag discreetly removed, but its absence impossible to ignore. Camilla's non-attendance wasn't a footnote, it became the headline. The Queen Consort's banishment from a ceremony that spotlighted Diana's life and charitable impact was more than a logistical change, it was a seismic message of division within the monarchy itself. William took the podium with deliberate calm. Behind his measured tone lay a torrent of truth he could never fully share with the public. But those who listened closely heard it in every syllable. He spoke of legacy, not just of his grandmother's reign, but of courage shown in silence, dignity unshaken by manipulation, and a kind of love that withstands the weight of history. These words weren't crafted for royal neutrality, they were laced with veiled clarity. A quiet storm rolled behind his every phrase. He didn't name names, but the omission was loud enough to feel like an indictment. He called for a return to integrity, for remembrance that wasn't scripted by politics or rewritten by those desperate to control perception. As William closed his speech, the camera panned. Catherine, standing nearby, blinked away tears as she clutched the program. Her composure cracked for only a second, but the emotional wave it unleashed was instant. Around the world, viewers responded not with confusion, but with clarity. This was more than a tribute, it was an unspoken reckoning. Within hours, the internet was ablaze. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Justice for Diana and hashtag Empty Seat began trending across platforms. Commentators dissected every word, every glance, every breath. Yet it wasn't William's expression or Catherine's tear that stole the narrative, it was Anne. The Princess Royal, never one for drama or deviation, stood as still as marble during the entire speech. But when William mentioned those who suffered for speaking truth, her gaze locked on the empty seat. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. It was a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the fact that she held it for 10 full seconds. Those watching knew then and there something had shifted. Anne wasn't just present, she was participating. And with that stare, she signaled her silent allegiance not to protocol but to justice. The ceremony ended not with applause but with reflection. Guests left quietly. Reporters whispered into phones. The monarchy had spoken, though not through official statements or rehearsed interviews. It had spoken through an absence, through an unoccupied space that echoed louder than any presence. For many, it felt like Diana had finally been heard not through words, but through action. And for Camilla, it marked a turning point she could no longer ignore. But as the world speculated, Camilla was preparing a response of her own, and it was anything but apologetic. Camilla wasn't going to stay silent. Within 24 hours of her public humiliation, private letters, family secrets, and years of confidential communications began appearing in the hands of select media outlets. Her message was clear. If she was going down, she wasn't going alone. What began as whispers quickly spiraled into a full-blown media wildfire. Leaks started emerging through obscure foreign tabloids, strategically bypassing the traditional British press. But soon, the headlines were impossible to ignore. Anonymous sources confirmed the files were real. Carefully curated emails, notes, and decades-old memos painted a picture that struck at the very heart of the monarchy's carefully preserved image. Stories emerged of emotional rifts between Charles and William, letters written during moments of deep tension, including one where Charles allegedly wrote, "I fear I am losing you, not just as a son, but as an heir to my legacy." Another leak claimed that Catherine had once begged William to walk away from royal duties altogether, exhausted by the relentless pressure and media warfare. There was no mercy in what was being released. Camilla's retaliation was calculated, sharp, and targeted with surgical precision. The true shock came from inside the palace walls. An unnamed aide revealed that shortly after William's decision to bar her from the royal event, Camilla had erupted behind closed doors. Her words were reportedly chilling. "Let's see how they like the truth." But it wasn't truth she was wielding, it was leverage. Documents detailing controversial financial transfers, unused charitable funds, and even internal memos about security concerns mysteriously found their way into the hands of investigative reporters. These weren't random acts. This was scorched earth. A final defense from a woman who had spent decades climbing the palace ladder and now found herself dangling by a thread. Charles, caught in the crossfire, reportedly had a full-scale meltdown upon discovering the extent of the leaks. For a monarch who had spent his life trying to maintain an image of resilience and stability, This unraveling was personal. Staff described shouting matches between him and Camilla, with accusations hurled and regrets voiced. One insider quoted Charles as saying, "You've undone everything." But by then, the damage had already been done. The press, once cautiously deferential, now smelled blood. For the first time in years, the monarchy wasn't just being questioned, it was being dissected in public view. William, blindsided but not broken, immediately moved to contain the fallout. A team of legal advisors was assembled. Confidentiality clauses were reviewed. Emergency communication strategies were put into place. Yet, even as they scrambled, it became clear the public's trust was teetering. Catherine, usually shielded from the harsher storms, found herself on the front lines. Reports hinted at sleepless nights, intense briefings, and moments where even she questioned how much further this conflict could go. Princess Anne, too, was dragged into the fray. Old correspondences were twisted, reshaped to imply disloyalty, feeding the narrative that the royal family was imploding from within. But amid the chaos, something else was happening, something quieter, yet potentially more dangerous. As headlines screamed and alliances fractured, a new figure began re-emerging from the periphery. One who had been watching, waiting, and holding on to truths that even Camilla dared not expose. As the palace descends into chaos, one unexpected ally re-emerges, someone who may hold the final piece of this dangerous puzzle. She had stayed quiet through the years, stoic, composed, loyal. But now, Princess Anne steps into the fire. And what she reveals not only justifies William's fury, but confirms that Diana's fears weren't paranoia, they were prophecy. For decades, Anne had been the iron spine of the royal family, unyielding, discreet, unwavering in her duty. But behind the shield of silence, she had witnessed more than the public could ever imagine. She had watched as Diana was slowly edged out, as Charles grew increasingly distant, and as Camilla's presence morphed from secret companion to commanding force. For years, Anne had held her suspicions close, guarding them like a quiet ember. But when the chaos exploded around William, when the palace began to fracture under the weight of revelations and retaliations, she could no longer stay silent. In a private meeting between siblings long divided by distance, but now bound by truth, Anne entered William's study with a sealed envelope in hand, one marked in Queen Elizabeth's own script. The contents of the letter would never be released publicly, but sources close to the family claim it was a haunting document. Written in the final months of the Queen's life, the letter was part reflection, part confession. In it, she expressed doubts that had apparently haunted her for years. "I trusted the wrong woman with the future of the crown," she wrote, an admission that stunned even William. She spoke of how Camilla had gradually influenced Charles' decisions, disrupted internal family communication, and fostered divisions under the guise of unity. The Queen had begun to see that what appeared to be resilience in Camilla may have been cunning, masked as duty. Anne's voice reportedly trembled when she told William, "I should have said something years ago." She recounted moments during Charles's separation from Diana when messages were intercepted, phone calls diverted, and narratives rewritten, all with Camilla's subtle orchestration. Anne had always suspected the manipulation, but had lacked the proof. Now, with the Queen's letter in hand, everything she feared had been validated. It wasn't just family politics, it was a long game of positioning, played with quiet ruthlessness. In that moment, a wall between Anne and William collapsed. The guarded Princess Royal, once skeptical of Diana's emotional pleas, once dismissive of Charles' blindness, looked her nephew in the eye and said the words he hadn't expected to hear. "We must protect what she left behind." The weight of that sentence carried not just responsibility, but a sacred trust. Diana's legacy wasn't a memory, it was a mission. And now, two of the monarchy's most stalwart figures stood united under its banner. For William, it was the final confirmation he needed. This wasn't a vendetta. It wasn't about bitterness or family wounds. It was about restoring the truth that had been buried beneath decades of deception. Anne's support wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. She knew where the fractures were, who had enabled them, and what needed to be dismantled. The letter, the confession, the alignment, it all pointed to a single conclusion. The monarchy could no longer protect those who had used its power for personal gain. Now armed with Anne's support and the Queen's letter, William makes the most controversial decision of his life, and it's only the beginning. It wasn't just a ban. It was the first domino. William's quiet war for the soul of the monarchy has begun, and in his hands is a list. A list of who stays and who is never allowed to return. The monarchy is about to be reshaped forever. With Anne by his side and the Queen's words etched into memory, William began dismantling the foundation of the quiet corruption that had eaten away at the crown from within. But he did so with precision, not spectacle. No press conferences, no emotional statements, just action. One by one, names were being reviewed behind closed palace doors. Titles that had once been handed out in trust were now under scrutiny. Patronages once used as shields for hidden agendas were being re-evaluated. And those whose loyalty had long rested with Camilla's inner circle began to feel the walls close in. Several senior figures, long considered untouchable, were quietly asked to step down or transition into private advisory roles. But in reality, they were being removed silenced, not with disgrace, but with deliberate invisibility. Camilla's position as Queen Consort remained intact, at least by name. But her presence was being erased from the spotlight. Invitations once automatically addressed to her began arriving for Catherine instead. Where Camilla had once spoken for the family at charities and ceremonies, Catherine now stood front and center, her grace and steadiness drawing comparisons not just to Queen Elizabeth, but to Diana herself. The public noticed. The media responded. What once felt like a monarchy teetering on the edge now began to resemble a rebuilding under a different kind of leadership, one forged from scars, not ceremony. And as Catherine stepped into this renewed role, her composure sent an undeniable message. The monarchy was being reshaped, and this time, truth had a seat at the table. Internally, William ordered a complete review of security protocols surrounding royal archives. The folder he had found, the one that changed everything, had been buried too well. He wanted answers. Who had hidden it? Who had known it existed and said nothing? An internal task force was created to investigate tampering and misclassification within the royal record. It was no longer about punishing the past. It was about protecting the future. Whistleblowers were offered immunity. Digital trails were traced. And with each uncovered file, the shape of the old system grew clearer along with how deeply its roots had spread. But while William waged his silent revolution, the public watched with growing admiration. He wasn't speaking in sound bites or hiding behind polished portraits. He was acting. And for a generation disillusioned by scandal and silence, that meant everything. Media began calling him the people's protector, a man who had inherited a fractured legacy and dared to repair it, not with fanfare, but with fire. Polls surged. Public approval soared. For the first time in years, the royal family felt human again, vulnerable, conflicted, and brave enough to admit when something had gone terribly wrong. And still, in the echoes of reform and resolution, William knew something remained unfinished. Victory had come at a cost. Truth had found its voice. But the one person who had always seen the storm before anyone else still had one more thing to say. But even in victory, shadows linger, and as the dust settles, one final message arrives that brings William to tears. Folded neatly inside an old book William once read with his mother was a note he'd never seen before. Addressed simply, "For William, if the time comes." What he read next, in Diana's unmistakable hand, confirmed everything and offered one final plea. It had been weeks since the storm settled. The palace had grown quieter, but the silence was dense, carrying the weight of everything that had transpired. William, seeking a moment of solace, wandered into a private corner of his residence where a few of Diana's old belongings had been stored, tucked away, not in tribute, but in protection. Among them was a book they had read together once, a collection of poetry she loved, pages marked and worn at the corners. As he turned them, something fell loose. A folded note, fragile with age, fluttered onto his lap. The ink had faded, but the message burned with clarity. In Diana's handwriting, so familiar it brought tears to his eyes before he even read the first word, was the guidance he hadn't known he still needed. In the note, Diana spoke not like a princess, but like a mother preparing her son for battles she had seen coming long before he did. She told him to follow truth, even if it cost him tradition. She told him to protect his heart, to protect his brother, and most importantly, to never let them silence him. She wrote that history would try to twist him, power would try to mold him, but he must never forget who he is or who she was. The words weren't grand. They were intimate, precise. Written for a moment she sensed would arrive but never wanted to witness. William reportedly read the letter in silence, overcome by an emotion no audience would ever see. There were no cameras, no statements. Just him, alone with the voice of the one person who had always seen him, always believed in him. And when he reached the final line, his breath caught. I see you. I love you. Always. In that moment, everything came full circle. The pain, the truth, the war he had just fought it all crystallized into purpose. He didn't tell anyone about the letter. Instead, he folded it gently and placed it inside the inner pocket of his suit. The same suit he would wear at his next royal engagement. No one knew it was there. No one could see the weight he carried next to his heart. But as he stood before the world once more, steadier than ever, the letter was with him an invisible armor of love, a silent promise fulfilled. And as William steps into the spotlight once more, the monarchy watches in silence, unsure whether it has just been saved or completely rewritten. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.